Right, ladies and gentlemen, let's go on a road trip. We are going to go to a place called sunny Dalmarnock. Now, the reason we're going to sunny Dalmarnock is because, well, it's part of the higher course. Part of the higher course is urban. And looking at urban, let's turn this off. Looking at urban, we have to look at two different cities. One city in a developed country and another in a developing. The city that we look at in a developed country is Glasgow. Makes sense because it's the one that you know. It's the one that you have the best background knowledge of. Perhaps not as exciting as looking at somewhere else, but we're not here for the excitement, we're here for the A's. Now, when we look at these cities, we have to do the same thing in both of them. We have to explain the current problems and the changes that are taking place in those cities. This is an incredibly important topic because for the first time ever in humanity's history, more than 50% of the entire planet is now living in an urban area, is now living in a city. And the management of these cities is critically important. We have made so many mistakes in the management of British cities, in all developed cities really, that we should be taking those mistakes, learning from them, not replicating them, and certainly not allowing, that's perhaps the wrong word, but certainly not we should be helping developing countries not to make the same mistakes that we did, because they're going through exactly the same processes. So what we're doing now is we're driving over to the east end of Glasgow because we're going to look at the first of the two issues that developed cities have to look at, and that's housing. We'll look at housing problems and then we'll look at transport problems. Now, the transport problems you'll actually know a fair bit about because it's very similar to what we did at Nat 5, looking at the strategies used in Glasgow city centre to try and reduce the amount of traffic congestion that we have to deal with in Glasgow. The housing problems is different. We haven't really looked at that before, and it's a difficult topic to teach because what you need to know from the exam is about this much, but the context that you need to know to really understand all the changes that have happened is huge. We could literally teach you it for weeks. So I'm going to give you a brief potted history of Glasgow, and this is not for the exam. So Glasgow started off actually originally as a religious site just north of the river. That's why we have the cathedral up there. Glasgow was a dry crossing point, rather it was one of the last crossing points of the River Clyde before you went down further into the estuary and the river got too big. These were some of the locational factors that made Glasgow grow from hundreds of years ago. But Glasgow didn't really do much past that original religious settlement until it started to industrialise. And it was when it industrialised that's when Glasgow bloomed and grew and started to equal and then overtake Edinburgh in terms of size. When we industrialised, remember the oldest part of the city, the central business district where the cathedrals and the city centre is, when that grew out and industrialised, we started to build the factories on the River Clyde right beside the CBD, and those factories needed workers, so we shipped in lots of farm workers from the countryside that no longer had jobs out in the countryside because they'd been made effectively unemployed from the introduction of mechanisation. So we needed fast, cheap, affordable housing to put these workers into. Now, the tenements that we threw up in our inner cities, what is going to become our inner cities, were not great. We threw up these sandstone tenements that they were overcrowded. They didn't have indoor plumbing, indoor toilets. It was an outdoor communal toilet. Those tenements weren't actually enough housing for the amount of workers that actually came. So we started to put multiple occupancy, what we would call nowadays is multiple occupancy. So the houses that we know living in tenements are not the houses that we had back then. it was a single end that you got, which was basically one room. So think about a house that's in a tenement now, where you would go in and you would have a hallway and a kitchen and 2 or 3 bedrooms off of it. That wasn't the case back then. You had one room per family, and you lived there, you worked there, you slept there, you ate there, all in that single room. So they were pretty squalid conditions. And after the war, these squalid conditions really they were not fit for what we would expect to think of as modern Britain. So many of them were torn down, then replaced with high-rise flats. This then coincided with the deindustrialisation of Glasgow. So Glasgow was industrialised, that's when we brought in factories and factory workers. It then deindustrialised when we lost those factories. Those shipyards that once employed tens of thousands of people, they stopped operating for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons was the River Clyde is too shallow. We could only build boats to a certain size, but the world started to demand bigger and bigger cargo vessels that we couldn't build. Other countries had also started to move on to newer technologies that were that could produce boats faster and more cheaply, so we couldn't compete, and those factories started to close down. When those factories started to close down, we then had tens of thousands of people living in pretty squalid conditions, and started with unemployment now as well. Now, one of the areas, we're going to look at a couple of areas across Glasgow, but one of the areas across Glasgow that really suffered from this was Dalmarnock. Now, Dalmarnock's in the east end of Glasgow. What I'd like you to do now is pause the video, or stop the video if you can, look at the time that we are at the moment, go open up Google Maps on your iPad and find Dalmarnock, have a look at where Dalmarnock is. So go do that now. Okay, so you've hopefully had a look at Dalmarnock, seen where it is, what's round about it. You might already have recognised some of the landmarks that are there, the Chris Hoy Velodrome, or the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome, and the Parkhead Stadium is not far away, and the Athletes Village for the Commonwealth Games, and these are places that we'll have a look at and talk about. But Dalmarnock, if we go back to our potted history of Glasgow, Dalmarnock was an industrialised area, had plenty of tenement flats, a bit like the tenements that we're driving past now, sandstone tenements, and tens of thousands of people lived there. I think it was, off the top of my head, I think it was something like 20,000 people lived there. But after deindustrialisation, once those factories went, once those jobs went, the reason that for people to live there also went. People couldn't continue to live there if there was no work. All you would end up was with mass unemployment. Sorry, just taking a turn a wee bit late. All you'd end up with mass unemployment, which is what happened, and most people who could get out of Dalmarnock did. So we ended up with Dalmarnock being in a situation where it had large amounts of land which had been deindustrialised, where the factories had closed. So large swathes of derelict land, derelict abandoned factories. Often the land had been poisoned by years of industrial use. We had a depopulation of the area as well. So an area that used to hold tens of thousands of people in a strong working community now had a few thousand people. And so you had streets where many of the closes were empty, or you would go into a close in a tenement building and perhaps of the 8 houses that were there, only one of them was occupied in the whole close. When you have that depopulation of an area, you have a breakdown of its community. Think about the shops and services that provide service to the population that's there. If shops that were there that used to provide a service to tens of thousands of people now don't have tens of thousands of shoppers, now have a few hundred people that they can choose from, that can choose to go to that shop. That's no longer enough of a customer base to keep that shop, that cafe, that restaurant, whatever it is, that hardware goods store. That's now no longer enough people to keep that shop functioning. So it closes down. So we now have large parts of the city, large parts of the area, Dalmarnock, with few people living in the closes, lots of houses abandoned or left derelict, lack of shops and services, and that's not just commercial operations but also social council operations such as schools and nurseries. If a school doesn't have enough pupils, the council closes it down, and that's the situation that happened in Dalmarnock. The kids that went to school, who lived in Dalmarnock but went to school, didn't go to school in Dalmarnock. They were put into minibuses and shipped out of the area to the nearest local primary school and the nearest secondary school. So we have an area that's completely underserviced. We have an area that has too sparse a population to try and maintain a cohesive community. We have an area that's underserved with jobs, so we have high levels of unemployment. With high levels of unemployment comes lots of other social problems such as alcoholism, substance abuse, petty crime. We have large amounts of the area which are now abandoned and derelict. Abandoned and derelict buildings attract things like graffiti and vandalism. When you have abandoned and graffitied buildings, they make the place look unattractive, they make the place feel unsafe, and that unsafe, unattractive feeling means that nobody wants to go there. A business doesn't want to start up there. If you're trying to attract customers in and you want to say, come over to Dalmarnock, the place looks terrible, it's not going to win customers. So attracting businesses back in was hard. If you were to build some new posh houses, how could you sell them in a place like Dalmarnock where there is no shops, no local school, no services to speak of, and the place looks run down, unloved, and looks like there could be criminal goings on because people see the abandoned buildings, people see the vandalism, and so it makes them feel unsafe. So Glasgow, with areas such as Dalmarnock, had this huge problem. Housing stock that people didn't want because it was the wrong shape and size, and we'll talk about Glasgow's changing demographics later. We had a problem of large areas of the community in Dalmarnock being left derelict and abandoned, and so not fit for new businesses to come into. Large parts of the landscape had been poisoned by years of industrial use. And finally, a lack of shops and services that had meant that the people who were there were not being serviced in the way that they needed to be. So that's the kind of potted background history that we need to understand what's going on in Dalmarnock. What we're going to do is talk about some of the problems that were there that then had to be addressed, because your exam, everything we talk about now, will be examinable. Your exam's going to ask for a couple of things from housing, which is what were the problems that Glasgow faced with its housing stock, and then secondly, the second version that they come in with that is what did Glasgow City Council do to address the problems? What were the management strategies that were brought in? How did we try to redevelop these areas? And at the moment we're driving through one of these areas. This is the Gorbals. Just behind me, or just over my shoulder, just over here, we've got a new retail park that is the first thing that's been built in this derelict land in at least 40 years, because in my life that land has always been derelict. We're just going to drive along past the Gorbals, and we'll hopefully be able to stop and have a look in the Gorbals as well. Anyway, we'll come back once we have arrived. See you soon. Well, we are here in Dalmarnock, and I've had to be very careful in the places that I've chosen because it's hard to actually find a bit of Dalmarnock that looks bad enough from the picture that I want to paint. So what I have behind me is the classic sandstone tenements that we had all over Glasgow's inner city. Just behind me now, I think you should be able to see some of the mini high-rise flats that replace much of the sandstone tenements, and there's still some building work going on behind me. So this was an area that had huge depopulation. Thousands of people moved away to try and find work. The quality of these buildings had been left pretty dilapidated. They had been renovated over the years, had indoor plumbing and stuff like that, but still were not really fit for purpose in many ways. And they weren't the type of housing that Glasgow's changing population needed. When we looked at demographics, when we looked at population, we've seen how that developed countries have many more old people. And if you're an older person living in a close that has to walk up numerous flights of stairs, it's just not suitable type of housing for many older people who need lower down housing. We also had many more families who were single parent families or multiple nucleus families. So we had an increase in our population, we'd had an ageing population, we had people wanting more smaller houses rather than bigger houses with more rooms, and these types of houses just didn't fit that. Also, there's a real lack of on-street car parking and outdoor space. Again, not the type of lifestyle that many people wanted. People wanted a driveway, somewhere to park their car. In fact, I had to drive around for quite a while before I could find somewhere to park my car. So Glasgow's housing problems were the houses that we had were not in great condition. They didn't suit our changing demographics because we now had a more older population, and we also had more multiple nucleus families that were looking for smaller houses rather than 4 and 5 bedroom apartments. They didn't offer on-street car parking, and they didn't offer any outdoor space either. So how did we go about fixing that? How did we what types of houses did we build to replace that? That's what we're going to look at next. But one of the other issues that we had to we spoke about on the way over was the lack of services. And if you just behind me, I don't know if you'll be able to see, just over here we have a pub, and then there's another pub, and an off licence, and a solicitors. So not exactly the best place to go if you need to nip out and get some bread and milk or get some groceries. And again, if you were someone who didn't drive a car, your ability to get around and get to other stores is very limited. It's a place that was poorly served by public transport. So we had that lack of services that were available. Now, hopefully what you can see over my shoulder, just this Parkhead stadium, but also the tenement buildings where they just seem to abruptly stop. That's because many of these tenements were then knocked down. Either knocked down and replaced with something else, or just knocked down and left. You walk around here, again you can see, well, this one's a Barber's, but this actually has been closed for a few years, I believe. It's just a real lack of services. Now, the third problem that we spoke about, not just the lack of commercial services, but social services as well, such as schools, nurseries, doctors, things like that. And that meant that kids who did live in these places had to be put into minibuses and shipped out to somewhere else. So we're now going to look at what was done to Dalmarnock to change the area, to help rejuvenate it, to help address these problems. So one of the main things that was done to address the housing problems that we had in Dalmarnock was this place. It was the athletes' village for the Commonwealth Games. Houses that were built under the auspices of housing the athletes, but really it was to provide a brand new range of housing stock for Glasgow's East End. And you can see the difference in the types of buildings that we have here. Each one of these long buildings is individual houses that are semi-detached from each other or terraced. They all have back and front gardens, they all have private parking areas, and They were designed in a way that made them much more energy efficient, much more attractive to look at architecturally, much nicer places to be inside, which meant that they were just a lot more attractive places to be. So attractive that when they originally, many of these houses were put up for sale privately. When they were put up for sale, the applications to try and buy these houses were multiple times more than the stock actually allowed for. Huge interest from all over the city to try and buy these houses. Many of them were sold off privately, some of them kept for local housing associations, so they're rented out. And one of the key things that they have, the design attributes that they have, is you can't tell which ones were private houses, which ones were local authority that are rented out, and all of the whole community was engineered rather than just haphazardly thrown together. Now, we'll go over to another housing development, more recent one, over in Oatlands, and we'll talk about some of the aspects of the architectural design. But for these, the main key points that you should know is that they were very energy efficient. Many of them have, like this one over here, has solar panels on the roof. A lot of them were heated off of a central energy efficient heating system, and they were built in a way that they don't use much heat either, so they're much cheaper to operate and environmentally beneficial as well. They were also engineered in a way that you can see that all of the houses look out onto the communal spaces. There is no areas in these houses where the quiet little nooks and crannies where you could go and do nefarious things. Everything is in the open and it's overlooked by other people in their houses, and that makes the place feel much safer. It's also in a different scale. Out in Dalmarnock, in the old Dalmarnock, you would have to walk great distances to try and get to a shop, to try and get to a bus stop, to try and get anywhere that you wanted. Here, everything seems really quite small, almost toy-like, and that smallness makes people feel safer, makes a community easier to foster. So, this was the Athletes' Village. That's probably the single greatest thing that we did to rejuvenate this area. Now, there has been problems with it. Some of the problems were that there just wasn't enough of it. There were several different housing associations where in this area, and each housing association was allocated a number of houses to then give out to the original people who lived in Dalmarnock, and there just wasn't enough to go round. Now, there's large parts of housing association houses just across the road, just behind these. And the people there didn't get any of the houses. I've went the wrong way. Didn't get any houses, and so there was left a real feeling of missing out, of being hard done by. And so we now have a situation where the people on the other side of the road, who are in the older style houses, have a certain level of animosity towards the people who seemingly did better than they did and got given one of these new fancy houses. And that leads to a little bit of social tension. But let's move on to the next thing. So, behind me we have the Athletes' Village, and just across the road we have the Legacy Hub. Now, the Legacy Hub was built to try and help replace the old Dalmarnock Community Centre that used to be there. The Dalmarnock Community Centre was very well used by a few number of people. And this was brought in as part of the regeneration of the area. It's a community space that's open to all different community projects that do different community work. But really the important thing for us to think about in terms of our assessment is what was attached to it. When they built this, they were trying to think about what was lacking in Dalmarnock and the problems they had with services. And so they built in shop fronts along the bottom here. And these shop fronts were then given out to businesses initially free of charge. I don't know if it's still free of charge, but certainly initially it was. And at the moment what we have here is a pharmacy, a chemist, and then a medical practice in beside it, and at the very end there's a dentist there. Now, these were services that Dalmarnock was completely lacking in. And you can't force a dentist to open up somewhere, you can't force a chemist to open up. So what they did was they built the premises and says, well, if anybody wants it for free, you can have it. So we have we've got our first real management strategy that's less obvious than just building new houses. We had the problem of lack of social services. So how did they get round that? Well, they built the Legacy Hub to provide community project space, but also to provide shop fronts which could be given out to attract businesses in. They then went on to try and attract other types of business in, other types of companies to open up, and they did that by regenerating Dalmarnock train station. It was millions of pounds were spent on Dalmarnock train station to make it nicer to use, easier to use, more accessible, and just making it look like something a city in the 21st century would have. We're also right beside some high capacity motorways, which we'll point out, and so it's actually quite a good location for business. But we'll move on. So we've had housing that didn't really fit the bill, so new houses that were more designed better for what people actually wanted, lower down for easier access for older people or people with disabilities. We've had a lack of services, so we had the Legacy Hub being built, which had shop fronts which were given out to businesses for free. We also had a lack of services for people in the local area, and Silverdale Nursery here was built to provide nursery care and early years learning for the kids of Dalmarnock and the new Athletes Village, which is right behind. So we've went from an area where you had to walk miles, literally miles, to get to many of the services that people wanted to use, to we built a community that was, everything was in walking distance. It's sort of built on a different scale. It's built on a human scale rather than an industrial scale, which is what our old inner cities used to be like. So let's move round the corner now and look at some of the ex-industrial land. So we now find ourselves in a much more industrial part of Dalmarnock, and this was the industrial heartlands of Dalmarnock. And what we had was the problems that we spoke about. Deindustrialisation happened, which meant that large factories like this no longer had an economic place in Glasgow or in Dalmarnock, and these buildings, these old industrial buildings, were left to rot and become derelict. This one is now currently being demolished. Head over, might be able to see into the site a little bit. And you can see what's happening is the front fascia, the historical front brick fascia of this building's been kept, and inside it's been gutted and replaced with modern steel roof, modern steel beams that can then be engineered inside to create spaces that are more appropriate for modern industry, usually more small scale industry. So that's one of the ways that we've dealt with the problems of derelict buildings down here, is to renovate them, to make them more attractive for new industries. But that's really not the most common way. The most common thing that we did was just behind me. It was to demolish the buildings and then landscape them and put fences around the area. Now, fences seem like an odd thing to do when there's not fencing it, there's nothing in it to be fenced in. But what the fences do is they give the area a sense of enclosure, and not enclosure to keep things in, but rather just to give you a personal sense of this isn't one wild abandoned area. So this area has been landscaped. It's a bit hard to see under the snow, but they planted trees, they planted grass. Just over here we have architectural blocks, large stones and planters that have been put down just to make the area nicer to walk through. When the fences are up round about it, it stops anybody going in and fly tipping. It stops the area being used for... It's unimaginable some of the things that people can use different areas for when they seem abandoned. So this place was knocked down, flattened and landscaped. You can see there's quite a lot of landscaping on here, and then we have the big new Police Scotland building over behind. And again, that was a conscious decision to put that there. We are having to try and attract people into an area. So what government can do is try to put government buildings into areas that they want to attract other businesses in, to show that it can be done. But also, thousands of people will work there, therefore hopefully creating more business for any other little shops and local businesses that open up. So the problem was deindustrialisation left a lot of abandoned empty factories. The solution was to renovate some of them to make them more attractive for new modern businesses, but the rest of them were demolished and flattened and then landscaped. They were landscaped to make it more attractive. They put fences round to stop fly tipping and to make the area feel safer. We also brought in new government buildings, such as the Police Scotland headquarters, again to make the area seem like it was more used, to make it seem more attractive to other businesses and to bring more people into the area. So you can see these abandoned plots of land now being flattened, ready to be built on. There's also the inclusion of modern street lighting, landscaping with these trees, new high quality pavements, and so this is now no longer just an area of abandoned land, but a potential business opportunity for anybody that wants to build there. If you are trying to bring new businesses in and they have to come in and clear a land of derelict buildings to make sure the land is safe because it hasn't been poisoned from industrial use, you're not going to get new businesses to come in and do that. But if the land has already been flattened, graded, and the soil has been checked out to make sure that it's not poisoned, it has road access, it has pavement access, all it needs is now just somebody to come in and build a business here. But you're doing everything you can to increase the chances of regenerating that area. Right, we are back in the car and we are going to head over to another development, not in Dalmarnock, just across the river, just south of the river from Dalmarnock, but part of, really, we could think of it as the east end of Glasgow. And it's a place, a housing development called Oatlands. Now, Oatlands could be your best case study really for talking about the types of new houses that have been brought into areas like this. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, go open up your Google Maps and have a look for the Oatlands housing development. It should be just beside Gorbals, so go do that. Okay, hopefully you have went and seen where Oatlands is. It might have taken you a while to get there, hopefully not. But it's not far away from where we are now, just round the corner. Now, when the question is asked, how did Glasgow change its deal with its housing problems? Well, there was a lot of problems we could talk about, but really what we're going to concentrate now on is the housing stock that we had was unsuited. It wasn't up to the quality of housing that people demanded. It didn't have outdoor space. It was an area that felt unsafe, that was underpopulated, and it didn't have the services that were needed. So we've looked at the provision of services, we've looked at the provision of the Athletes Village, and what we're going to look at is Oatlands. And Oatlands, why we're interested in this place is the architectural designs that were used in Oatlands to try and engender a more community spirit. So things that we want to look out for. We want to look out for different variations in housing shape and size so that it doesn't all look uniform. It looks much more natural, much more organically developed. We want to look for high quality buildings that offer maybe any indication that there is energy saving things like solar panels. We want to look for, is there any designation between private housing that people have bought, or social housing, like that's local authority rented out housing, or council houses as they used to be called. And we want to look at, is it been designed in a way that tries to engender community? Is everything in walking distance? Is there shops and services? Is things far apart? So let's go and see if we can find that. So this is the Oatlands building development, the Oatlands development rather. And one of the issues that was often raised with the Athletes Village was that the houses don't look like they belong in Glasgow. They were much more of a Scandinavian style, looked more like something you'd even find in Holland rather than in Glasgow. And when they built Oaklands, one of the choices that was made was to build buildings that were more reflective of Glasgow's previous architectural design. So effectively, buildings that look like the old tenement buildings. And these old tenement buildings went a long way towards reflecting Glasgow's past nature, past characteristics, and also trying to attract in a more affluent customer as well. If you go up to the west end of Glasgow, it's still up there, it's all tenement buildings. So being a tenement itself wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and so these were built to, like I said, reflect Glasgow's previous architectural history. But if we walk down further into the scheme, what you'll notice behind me is the M74 motorway, and that's one of the great benefits of this site, is it has its own access straight on to one of the major motorway that takes you down to England. And you can then go north up onto the M8 and straight into Glasgow city centre as well. In fact, the trees at the end of the street take you into effectively Glasgow Green, and you can walk into the city centre in no time at all. So if we were building houses to try and attract a more affluent, a more younger, a more upwardly mobile clientele, then this place has exactly what it needs. Great access to the city centre where jobs are, high quality housing that reflects Glasgow's history to make them more desirable. And it's got also much of the other things that we spoke about as well. For instance, houses that are not all the same, but are different shapes and sizes, so to make the place look more interesting, to make it look more organically built and developed. Places for people to park their cars off street, or certainly out of the main flow of traffic. You can see that there is no real through flow of heavy amounts of traffic. The streets are all at a very small scale, which again makes the place feel safer and more community driven. There is a show home just along this road, which looks like any other block of flats that are around here, and you cannot tell the difference between private houses. You can see this house over at the corner here just behind me, it's for sale. If we get a chance, I'll see if we can get onto Rightmove and see if we can get some pictures from inside it. So after having a quick look on the internet, I was able to find this, and we can see inside this house. Now imagine the type of housing stock that this would have been replacing in those old tenements, which were much more old-fashioned. Although they had been reconditioned to have more modern facilities, such as double glazing and central heating, this is a much more modern property with much more higher level fixture fittings. You can see there's much larger internal spaces. So here we have a communal kitchen and dining area. That reflects much more of a modern family lifestyle. We have up and down stairs so that people can better separate socialising space from sleeping space. We have very high quality bathroom fixtures and fittings, and well decorated and appointed, well proportioned sized rooms with lots of light. It looks like a warm house because obviously it will have been made recently up to the most rigorous building codes that we have in this country for heating and insulation. And you can see just a much more modern, open, airy, bright and welcoming type of house, as opposed to what we might have imagined the houses in the old tenements to be like. Also, these houses tend to have their own private space. This is a back garden with patio doors. But you can't tell which of these houses are local authority houses and which are privately owned houses, which is how communities should be. And certainly you can see from the cars that are parked here, it's all Audis, BMWs, Mercedes. It's certainly an affluent clientele that has moved in. Now, one of the other things that this was, way that this was built, you can see the fronts of people's houses all look onto the main streets, and that was to make the streets feel more overlooked and therefore more safe. There is a small provision of services in the centre of this. I think it's shops and a community centre, again to try and generate a sense of community. And so far this development has been incredibly successful. Right, we have just popped across the road to somewhere called the Gorbals, and I really just wanted to show you two of the last remaining high-rise tower blocks that are here in the Gorbals. Many Glaswegians would have family that used to live in here. Certainly I had aunts and uncles that lived here, but most of these now in the Gorbals are completely gone. They were knocked down for a number of reasons, so I'll get you at the sun. Knocked out for a number of reasons, primarily because of the building quality of them. When they were thrown up, they were literally thrown up with very poor design and very poor construction methods, which meant that inside they had real problems with damp. So many of these, the phrase that you need to know is that many of these high-rise buildings were torn down because of damp problems and antisocial problems. The area around these buildings was just not designed for humans to live in. Large open stretches of concrete, lots of underpasses, lots of places where it just wasn't nice to go to. It didn't look aesthetically pleasing. No open spaces for kids to play in, and altogether just a design that was not thought out for people first, but rather thought out for how many people could Glasgow City Council fit into a housing scheme for the least amount of money. And it ended up being expensive in the long run because they were torn down. So many of the high-rise flats have been torn down because of damp problems and antisocial problems. That's really the phrase that we need to know. What we're going to show you is, again, just one more bit of the Gorbals, explaining the other architectural elements that have been brought into housing developments here. So here we are, still in the Gorbals, just round the corner from the high-rise flats, back to the much more traditional tenement buildings that replaced the high-rise flats that were here. And one of the things that we wanted to point out is things like this, elements like this. Hopefully you can see it there. And it's the inclusion of artwork. And studied through the Gorbals, we'll find statues up on the buildings, up on plinths like this, just on the corners. And that artwork was to make the area look more desirable, make it look more pleasant, make it architecturally more interesting, but crucially to try and attract as many people to live in the area as possible. And it certainly worked. Not just the art, but along with all the other elements, it certainly worked. I'm going to take you to one of my favourite Gregs just now. Let's get in the car. Right, we are back in the car, and when I said I'm going to take you around to one of my favourite Gregs, it's for geographical reasons, not for rather sausage roll. One of the things I noticed was when you're a human geographer, you're interested primarily in cities, usually cities and people. And one of the amazing places around here is the Gregs, round at the little shops. When the Gorbals was renovated, these new houses were built, and it attracted in a completely new type of person that lived here. Now, like I said, I had family who lived here. It was a very working class area, proudly working class, but then when that deindustrialisation happened, the jobs went, a lot more unemployment came in, the housing stock was poor, we had lots of high-rise buildings where the grounds were not engineered for people to actually live there. So it got a reputation of a place that you didn't want to be. But when these flats were renovated, my wife and I tried to buy a flat down here when we were looking for our first home, and then quickly found out that we couldn't afford one. And when we were visiting the area looking at different flats, we seen the shops across here, and we walked past the shops, and inside the Gregs, which is just here in the corner, it was the most amazing queue in terms of a human geographer looking at the population of a community. It had your typical little old Glaswegian ladies. It had your typical Glaswegian Neds with their tracksuits tucked into their socks. And it also had a whole range of young professionals. People in suits, people in blouses and skirts that were clearly just coming out of their work and just heading home. And the Gregs is just across here. And it was it was the ideal situation that you want to see in a community that is being developed. A whole range of social classes, from the young to the old, from the rich and affluent to the working class and unemployed as well. And that was the first indication that I got that these developments were actually truly working, as opposed to some of the other developments that Glasgow City Council has undertaken over its years. Now, that's us done for today. What I don't want you to do is go away thinking, oh, I now know everything that I need to know about housing changes in Glasgow. You don't. Certainly not in the way that we have to know them. All we were doing today was getting some background contextual knowledge, making sure that you had actually seen the places that we were talking about, getting a little bit of a flavour for them, seeing what the history was, and putting down that bedrock of knowledge before we actually go on. So in the next lesson or two, we'll actually take it in a much more bullet point fashion of what were the housing problems, what were the strategies used to fix them, has that actually been effective? So I'm not going to ask for anything more today. There's no other written tasks other than the more that you can look at Google Maps and look at the 3 areas that we've visited, the Commonwealth Games village, the athletes village up in Dalmarnock, the Oatlands housing development, and then right beside it, the Gorbals. The more that you look at those, just getting to know the area, the better, even if it's only a couple of minutes. So, if you've stuck with me through to the end of this video, well done. Hopefully the sound has worked out, and we will do something more academic next time. See you all soon. Look after yourselves and each other. Bye.